going to turn now to human senses, our senses. We were all brought up with a fairly simple story here, which is that we have 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. They also all have fancy names. So when we're talking about sight, we might talk about vision. Hearing is audition. Taste is gustation. When it comes to touch, I don't know if you've heard this word, we often speak of haptic sensation. And smell is olfaction. But the big fancy Latin words aside, these are the 5 senses that we were brought up to believe deliver information to the world, to us. Recognition of these 5 senses has occurred independently in several different cultural contexts, but it should be noted that there's not always been the same 5. In particular, a 6th sense is claimed in certain Buddhist epistemologies, in which thought formations would form a 6th sense. So the way that we're coming at the senses is going to be somewhat culturally influenced. Nonetheless, it's a very useful starting point. But when we start to ask what is a sense, and why should we include or not include thought formations, for example, we find ourselves a little troubled. One thing we have available to us to shore up our choice of 5 is our leaning on the role of the nervous system. Have you ever seen a nervous system before? That's what the nervous system looks like. It's not just a brain, it's a whole thing that goes through the whole body. And it looks kind of spooky. So, one way of discussing senses is to note that, well, the nervous system, including the brain, is going to be important here. So we might look where stuff in the external world causes or influences what's going on in the nervous system. And those interfaces are called receptors, sensory receptors. So, in order to elaborate our picture of the 5 senses, we could start by looking, well, how many different kinds of receptors do we see? Well, there's a whole lot of receptors on the back of the eye and the thin skin called the retina. The retina is actually sort of an extension of the brain. We'll come to its plumbing in a later video. It's plumbed in really weird because your eyes don't go straight into your brain. They go to the back of your brain by a rather complicated route. And as patterns of light change on the retina, so activity in the nervous system changes. And we can demonstrate that activity in an awful lot of the brain changes as the pattern of light and dark changes on the retina. In fact, about half of the brain is implicated. So we're very, very visual animals. And in our treatment of perception, we will, as is perhaps too common, speak by and large of vision. But it should be remembered that vision, while it's our perhaps most important sense, it introduces puzzles that make it difficult to extrapolate from the human condition to the condition of other animals, for example. And in some respects, touch might be a better place to start. But we're taking a conventional view here. We're going to focus mainly on vision. Perhaps the second most important of these is hearing or audition. Now, the pinna, this part of the ear that's outside, doesn't contain any sensory receptors, except as part of the skin. Rather, the ear canal gives rise to the middle ear and then to the inner ear, where there are 2 structures, one of which is the cochlea. The cochlea is that curled up snake-like thing you can see in the picture there. And if we uncurl that snake or snail-like formation, we end up with a long tube. And inside this tube, there's a sensitive membrane called the basilar membrane. And that's where the receptors lie. Different points along the basilar membrane respond to different frequencies in sound. And so there's where the receptors for hearing are. They connect then to the brain again via some rather tortuous plumbing. But we found the receptors now for vision and for audition. Touch. Well, touch is distributed all over the body, isn't it? The whole outside of the body has different degrees of sensitivity, but all more or less sensitive to touch. And when we dig in here, we'll find multiple receptor types, and they correspond to multiple ways we find out about the world through our skin. There's not just one. So the idea that touch is a unified sense is going to break down a little bit here. So we find receptors which are sensitive to just very light touch, receptors which are sensitive to vibration. We find cells which are not really receptors, but they do cause the nervous system to do things, and those are nociceptors or pain receptors. Very non-specific. Remember, pain doesn't tell you what it's pain about. It's just kind of an alarm signal. There are more sensors in here which register heat, so that in order to find out if a fire is hot, you don't have to go and touch the fire. You can simply hold your hand up to the fire and you'll feel the heat. So that's a separate sensory modality called thermoception. There are sensitivities to pressure, deep pressure, as well as light touch, and to the texture of things. So touch, when you look at it this way, you come at and say, what kind of receptors are there that are interfacing between the world and the nervous system? We don't find a single sensory modality, we find 5 or 6. Smell, or olfaction, is a very highly developed sense in many animals. And if we were rabbits, that's probably where we would have started. But we're humans, and our sense of smell is not that keen, to be honest with you. Other animals would have a lot more to say here. And for us humans, the sense of smell is not clearly independent of the next sense, which is the sense of taste. Taste we associate with the mouth, and there we find a variety of receptors that, give us a basic articulation of the space of taste. So there are different receptors for sweet stuff, salty stuff, bitter stuff, sour stuff, and a 5th one called umami, which is stimulated by monosodium glutamate in food, often added as a flavor addition to Asian foods. So actually when we're eating and we're tasting something, there's a lot more going on than these simple 5 distinctions, because smell is crucially involved as well, and texture, and there's an awful lot more goes into our appreciation of food than we find in the sensory physiology of taste. So smell and taste are not clearly distinct from one another. And touch opened up to be several different kinds of sensory modalities. So this business of looking for the receptors is, to some extent, complicating our picture of 5 senses. But it gets more complicated because there's more kinds of receptors and more ways of sensing. An organ that doesn't get much attention is the vestibular organ. If we look into the inner ear again, as well as that snail-like cochlea, which is involved in hearing, there's another whole organ in there, which has 3 semicircular canals, and this has nothing to do with hearing. So in the inner ear, there's another sensory organ that has nothing to do with hearing. The semisensory canals are filled with fluid. They're at right angles to one another, and so they function like accelerometers. They register acceleration. They're very important for our perception of 3-dimensional space and noticing how we're moving through space. They work together with the eyes. They're part of the visual system in as much as the visual system is how we get command over the space we move around in. You may have had the following experience sometimes. If you're sitting in a train at a station and there's another train on the other track and you're looking out at the other train and your train starts to take off very, 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 very slowly and starts to move, and eventually when you get past the other train you realize, oh, I was wrong. It was the other train that was moving. You can be confused about which train is moving. Don't know if that's ever happened to you. It doesn't happen on buses. Why should that happen on trains and not on buses? The answer lies in the vestibular organ. Trains are, of course, very, very heavy, and so they take off very slowly, so there's almost no acceleration. Buses, of course, are jerking you around the whole time, so you're never in any doubt whether your bus is moving or not. But the absence of the acceleration signal means that relying on your eyes only can be misleading in this case. So that's another really interesting sensory organ which does and doesn't constitute a separate sense, works together with the eyes for our command of space. There's more. Distributed throughout the body, in the muscles and joints primarily, we have receptors which are sensitive to where the limbs and parts of the body are arranged in space and how they're moving through space. We use two fancy words for this. Proprioception refers to your awareness of the position of your body in space, and kinesthesia to that sense of movement that every dancer and gymnast knows. These are distributed throughout your whole body in all the muscles and joints. And of course, balance uses these as well together with the vestibular organ. So these sensory receptors are getting all mixed up. There's more. We're also aware of the state of our own body. The body is something we also need to know about. You may suddenly find yourself hungry or needing to pee, or you may find yourself nauseous or off color in some way. Your body may tell you that there's something wrong, or you may just be short of breath. The internal economy of the body means that the body needs to know what's going on and be alerted to dangers. And so there are receptors distributed throughout the guts, the heart, and the liver, and so on, all of which are influencing the activity of the nervous system, and they are grouped together under this one word, interoception. Intero, sort of how my body is on the inside. So the five senses is a useful way in everyday language of talking about the relationship between the senses and the world, or the nervous system, and the energies that we bathe in. But it turns out to be more complicated than that. And the five senses that we talk about classically are not simply taken from reading the nervous system, because when we go look at the nervous system and lean on that, we run into all that complexity. In Western philosophy of mind and Western science, there's a long history of developing an account of ourselves in which our knowledge is basically of two kinds. There's stuff we get from the senses, and there's abstract, conceptual stuff. This is a view that came from some of the history we covered in the first lecture, primarily that guy Immanuel Kant. What it means is that when we use the words sensation and perception, our language is always a bit unstable and actually bogged down in philosophical issues that we're not sensitive to. So as we've just described the senses, for example, it was assumed that they were inputs. This is a problematic view. We know this is a problematic view. They are not just inputs. And when we looked at the jellyfish, we saw that perception and action were not separable. It wasn't the case that perception was delivering something to a central system, which would then act. Nonetheless, in many of the accounts we build up, we enforce this kind of separation. So these words, sensation and perception, are confusable, and they are often confused in the literature. And just before we wrap up this video, when we say perception, I don't mean this in the loose sense of just how I feel about something. So I perceive the anger of the crowd, or the government perceives that some students are annoyed, or I have the perception that things are getting worse. It doesn't just mean opinion. What we are trying to get at is how our knowledge of the world and our ability to act in the world is mediated by the senses and our capacity for movement. Okay, we'll wrap this one up here.